Hey students, Assalamu alaikum. Today in this session we will talk about writing about politics. In previous classes we discussed some of ethical issues in reporting on politics and skills you need to be a good political reporter, and we also discussed special beats and beats reporting, so especially how to gather information. So in this session we discuss how to write an informed way which you readers or listeners can understand. So today in this session we will briefly talk about covering elections and other examples. So a main focus about writing politics. And dear students, politics should be reported in the same way as other news, giving the same thought to be the selections gathered and presentations of facts and opinions. So here we will talk about story structures. Political stories can be written in inverted pyramid style as we discussed in previous classes. However, because political issues can usually be seen from the number of different viewpoints, political stories are often more complicated to write than a simple report of an event. So you need to include factual details of any measures or decisions, but also report the different opinions on the issue. The simplest way of doing this is to start by giving one angle in the intro and first part of story, then switch to another view later. However, this approach can be unfair, especially in newspaper where the readers might lose interest before coming to the other comment. The best way to structure a news story to overcome this problem is to include reference to the another opinion earlier in your story. You do not have to give them full at the beginning of your story. You just need to mention them, then you can explain them in more detail further down. So the structure can also be used for long report on radio and television. However, for short reports, it does not make sense to change. So first, news first. As with other news stories, you should give the news first, the comment second. The only time you give the comment first is if you are writing a follow-up or a reaction story, in which case you refer back to the facts and already revealed. In case where your intro interrupts and events or announcements in different terms, perhaps putting a human face on a political announcements, you should immediately explain it. So the human face. Most political stories are about people, but many politicians and bureaucrats hide the human face behind the way they talk about issues and events. This is because they are specialists in politics and government and not in communication. They see things from the different angles and sometimes concentrate so much on the solving specific problems that they forget how it will appear to ordinary people. So it is the job and it is your job to express stories in human terms, what is happening to your readers and listeners where they live and work and play. For example, if the politicians talk about urban renewal or get further detail and write the story in terms which the people in the areas affected can understand. Compare the story on the following pages, see how the correct version concentrate on how the policy will affect the readers or listeners' lives, while a wrong version lack this human face. Politicians and public servants often hide the human face of events and issues behind difficult official language we call jargons. Sometimes they use it to dismiss real meaning of unpleasant facts or decisions. So the enemy is no longer killed, they are neutralized where they are used to be unemployed. Now we have a pool of reserve labor. The list is endless. When faced with a complicated ideas, do not be tempted to repeat it words for words and hope that some of your audience will understand. So your job is to cut through the jargon to show exactly how policies, rules and regulation will affect your readers and listeners. So now we will talk about elections as we discussed earlier. So one of the most important function of the media in democratic society is to act as a forum for discussions of issues, especially during elections. The media also provide platforms for political hopefuls to judge by the electorate. It is important, therefore, that in run-up to an election, you are fair to all sides and do not favor one candidate or party or another. One practical way is to keep running table of the amount of space or time you give to each party or political group, then adjust their coverage accordingly. Balance is best achieved by focusing on issue rather than one personality. If you give all candidates the chance to discuss the issues, you will get approximate balance. You should be particularly concerned with issues which will affect your readers or listeners. This includes such things as housing, education, health, law and order, transport, agriculture and fisheries. As well as discuss the issues, you should also try to educate your readers and listeners about the political and electoral process. Whenever you use a story about forthcoming election, you should ask, do I need to put in extra words of explanation? For example, you might need an occasional brief explanation of which party belongs to the opposition coalitions, or that what houses is not due for elections for another 2 years. So there are also basic concepts such as electoral rolls and registrations which need explaining from time to time. Try to combine the explanation in a new story itself rather than editing it on to the end. So dear students, when writing news stories in the run-up to elections and during the count, take special care that you give only those features which will be of interest of your readers, listeners and viewers without confusing them with unnecessary details. You should report the winning party and winner in electorates relevant to your audience as well as any significant losers. You should indicate how big the winning margin was, and remember that in many countries the new government does not exist until it is sworn in by the state or by the government. If you are presenting a special edition or program on election night, you have to plan well in advance. You must make sure you can get results quickly and accurately from available sources and prepare material for a background features to fill the gap. Journalists producing special radio or television program should invite experts guests onto show at certain time to break up what could otherwise be very long and boring program. Try to mix interviews or profile with up to the minute reports on the latest state of polling or counting, giving regular summaries of the results so far. Many people while tune in during the program just for the latest results. If they do not hear summary within 10 or 15 minutes, they will tune elsewhere or switch off. So although radio and television have the advantage of being able to present election results faster than newspaper broadcasters, so broadcasters are not able to give such detailed coverage. They can tell their listeners who has won, but radio in particular is not able to present the figures in the form of tables which people can examine for detailed information. So newspaper on other hand can present all the mass of detail for the readers to observe slowly, studying the results which particularly interest them and ignoring the others. So newspaper will usually wish to publish special results supplement with all the election results in it, as we practically see in the newspaper. So this is too will need carefully planning, especially accurate calculation of how much space the result will need. The rest of the space will need to give on the story summarizing the most interesting and significant results, giving information about people elected for the first time, and similarly the stories. It should also include table showing the new state of political parties as a result of the elections. So dear students, whenever you are writing for politics or you are writing about politics, so you should need the main points in mind. For example, tell your readers or listeners how political decision will affect their lives. It is very important, and then your job is to report different opinions, not to judge them. Be objective and cultivate a wide range of contexts. So whenever you are writing a report, so you should be objective, fair and balanced. So write a bright, interesting stories for a human face. Be fair to all sides. This is especially important during election time. So never support one party or one person. So you should be fair all sides and you should cover all the angles during reports. Today in this session we will talk about pressures on journalists. In this session we will discuss and consider the ways in which journalists are tempted to go against their ethical standards, and we also discuss the way to resist these temptations. As we know that journalists are professional peoples and to work within code of professional ethics. However, a journalist cannot operate in a vacuum, doing what they think is right without pressures being put on them. Journalists face pressures from a variety of sources, all trying to make journalists behave in a way which is not the way journalists would choose. It is important that journalists try to resist all these form of pressures as far as possible. So in this session we will talk about the kinds of pressures put on the journalist, what type of and what kind of pressures are there. So of course we are living in imperfect world and journalists are also imperfect, so journalists should try to resist the kinds of pressures which we will discuss now. So first of all we will talk about employers. So if you work for a government, for example journalists are work for a government or news organizations, then your government will be your employer. This could make it very difficult for you to report critically on things which the government is doing. For example, we have the political figures, ministers will often put pressures on public service journalists to report things which are favorable to the government and not to report the things which are unfavorable to the government. They can enforce public service discipline to make journalists do as the government wants. This is especially difficult to resist in small developing countries where there may be a little or no alternative employment. It is not only government-owned media where such pressure exists, though commercial media are paid for by a mixture of advertising and sales to increase the sales of newspaper, radio and television stations. Sometimes sponsors our cultural events and publicize them. So maybe sometime boss may demand more coverage for the event than it is worth in order to promote the event as much as possible. So journalists will need to pursue them of a danger of this, that other events will have to be neglected to give extra coverage to your sponsor event, and that will risk losing readers or listeners. Dear student, advertiser can also bring pressure to bear upon owners and editors. A big advertiser may threaten to stop advertising unless you run news reports of something good which the advertiser has just done, or much worse, it may be threatened to stop advertising unless you ignore news event which is unfavorable to the advertisers. News organizations should dismiss such threats and judge each story only on its news merit. However, this is easier in large community with a diverse and developed economy than it is a small country with developing economy. When a commercial news organization is operating on a tiny profit margin, it will not easy to turn away a big advertiser, and its owner may feel forced to give to the pressures. In some cases, the advertiser may even be the government. In many countries, the government is the biggest advertisers, with job advertisements, call for tender, public announcement, and so on and so forth. And this can be a way in which government bring indirect pressure to bear upon commercial news media. So now we will talk about the authority. Dear students, both government-owned and commercial news media may pressure from authority or face pressure from the authority, the government, the police station, customs, and other branches of authority. Government can threaten or make laws to force all news media to be licensed. This would give them power to grant licenses only to those news organizations which please the government. Even the threat to introduce such legislations may be enough to frighten journalists and to make them afraid of criticizing the government. The best way to resist such pressure is to stimulate public debate on the issues of media licensing. As with any proposed legislations, the new media should encourage public debate before it coming, so the leaders have the opportunity to judge public opinion. In society generally is opposed to licensing of all news media, then democratically elected government will think very seriously before introducing such things. On the other hand, society wants news media to be licensed by the government. Then it is something which journalists will just have to accept, however much they may disagree with it. Other forms of authority may bring pressure to bear on your less official ways. Police may attempt to confiscate your camera when you are taking photographs. So the editor will be best resist this kind of pressure by knowing precisely what he is allowed to do and what he is not allowed to do. If he knows that the police are acting outside their power, he can politely approach a very senior police officer or even police ministers and report the incident. They can then handle it. If the police act outside their power and no action is taken even though it has been reported, then editor can publicize the facts in major news stories. It is wise though to try to sort out such problems quietly first, since in this way future relations may be more positive. So next point is threats. Many people think that they can avoid bad publicity by threatening journalists with violence or with legal actions. Such threats should always be resisted. Junior journalists should always report any threat which they have received to their editor. If the threat was a threat of violence, then editor should seriously consider informing the police. It is usually a criminal offense to threaten violence against somebody, and journalists are protected by such laws as much anybody else. If the threat is of legal action, then the editor's response will depend upon the facts of the case. The editor should know the law. The editor should know the laws well enough to judge whether or not take the threat seriously. If he suspects that there may be a ground or for a legal action, he should consult a lawyer. Then if he finds then he or his reporter is in the wrong, of course he should immediately set things right. However, he finds that there is no basis for legal action, then he and his reporters can happily ignore the empty threat. Now we will talk about bribes. Journalists do not usually earn big money. You may therefore be vulnerable to bribery. Somebody offering money in turn for favorable stories being written or unfavorable stories being ignored. To accept the bribe is dishonest. Journalists who offer bribes will usually be offered them in private. This is so that the person attempting the bribe can later deny that it ever happened. If this happens, you should immediately invite somebody else into the room and then ask the briber to repeat their offer. They are unlikely to do so, but if they do, you will have a witness. So now we will talk about gift and freebies. Commercial companies sometimes try to buy journalist friendship by giving them small presents or by giving them the opportunity to travel at a company expense called freebies. Often this travel is legitimate. An airline which is introducing new routes to and from our countries may well offer you free seats on the first flight. You will then have the opportunity to write from the first-hand experience about the services and about the destinations. If the airline is confident that its service is good and then destination is interesting, then will be satisfied that whatever you write will be good publicity for them, as long as it is understood that you are free to write whatever you like without company that provides a free travel having any influence. Such as arrangement is acceptable. However, if you are offered a ticket in return for writing something nice about the company, that is not acceptable. Poor newspaper, radio and television station may be grateful for charity to top up travel budgets, but they should never be so poor that they sell their professional honors. In any case, such offers should never be accepted or negotiated by the junior journalist. Only the editor should do so, and the offer must be referred to the editor. The editor can judge whether or not the terms of the offers are acceptable. Now we will talk about family. In many societies, a person's first loyalty is to member of their extended family or tribe. This is expected to take priority over all other loyalties, including their loyalty to the ethical standards of their professions. Thus, a doctor who saved the life of traditional clan enemy could meet with disapproval from his own relatives. Journalists to face conflict of loyalty like this. It may not only be pressure from your family or tribe, it may also be from members of club or associations to which you belong. For young journalists in small society, this is often the hardest kind of pressure to resist. It is important, therefore, that you avoid such conflicts of interest whatever possible. If you are told by your editor to cover story which involves your own extended family or tribe, you should point out the editor this conflict of loyalty and ask them the story assigned to another reporter. The hardest job is that of the editor himself. He cannot avoid the clash of responsibility in this way and must make the decision either to please his family and sacrifice his organization credibility, or maintain his professional standards and cut himself from his family. Now we will talk about tradition. In societies which are in rapid change from traditional to modern Western ways, there is often clash between the way in which things were done in the past and the way which the profession says that should be done now. For example, freedom of speech may itself be a recent important concept. Traditionally, it may be only men of a certain rank had a right to express their views, or a certain clan had the right to express their views on a certain subjects, and it may be the case that a very few people had the right to questions. All this is very different to the Western style free press in which everybody is encouraged to speak, or even subject and journalists, however, junior are encouraged to cross-examine the leaders, however, seniors. Tradition will often be used as a weapon to pressure journalists into a pattern of behavior which go against their professional ethics. Junior journalists should always report such incidents to their editor and seek guidance. The way forward will require careful thoughts. The professional ethics of journalists may still be developing. They will be influenced by the professional journalist ethics in other countries where journalism is more established, but they will also be influenced by the tradition of your society. Out of clash of cultures, new cultures may develop suitable for your society in modern world. Another journalist in your society can form these new ethical standards for your society and must be prepared both listen carefully to other points of view and act according to your judgment. Well, these are standards are emerging. Sometimes personal convictions. Journalists may come under pressure from their own strong beliefs. So, for example, a journalist who is deeply opposed to capital punishment may be writing story about crime. In this course of gathering information that may introduce somebody who calls for a death penalty as the answers to increasing crime, the journalist may be tempted not to report these comments and to leave the questions of capital punishment out of the story. This would clearly be unethical. It is as bad to censor the news to suit your own views as it is to censor the news to please your families or tribes. This contrary to the most fundamental principle of free speech that make a disagree with what somebody says, but we must fight to defend their rights to say. It is not only the things you really believe in which may cause problems. Some journalists accept contracts to advertise products as the way of earning some extra money. You must think carefully before you doing this. Now we'll talk about code of ethics. In many countries, journalists try to work with professional code of ethics. This is usually laid down in simple, straightforward terms, the kind of things they should and should not do. Typically, such code contains rules about issues such as honesty, fairness, independence, and respect for the right of other people, such as interviews, victims, readers, and listeners. In most free press democracies, journalist codes of ethics are usually voluntary, perhaps monitored by professional associations of journalist unions. In such cases, the only real sections against journalists who breach the codes are criticized from colleagues and perhaps loss of membership of the association or union. In some cases, media employers might be used the journalist code of ethics to set standards for journalists they employ, in which case breaches of the codes might lead to discipline or even sacking. In some countries where the media are suppressed, the government may try to control what is written or broadcast by imposing code of ethics backed by law and policed by the authority. These are like any other laws in such countries. Breaking them maybe lead to punishment. So it is up to journalists themselves to decide whether to obey oppressive codes or follow the higher principles of journalistic ethics and risk of the consequences. So respect for the truth and public right to information are fundamental principle of journalists. and journalism. Journalists describe society itself. They convey information, ideas, opinions, a privileged role. So they search, disclose records, questions, entertain, suggest, and remembers. They inform citizen and democracy. They give practical form to freedom of expression. Many journalists work in private enterprises, but all have these public responsibilities. They scrutinize power but also exercise it and should be accountable. Accountability, trust. Without trust, journalists do not fulfill their public responsibilities. So journalists should be honest, fairness, independence, and respect for the rights of other.